July 1879. Lieutenant General Frederick Augustus Thesiger, 2nd Baron Chelmsford, sat in his command tent at Ntonjaneni, 30 miles from the Zulu capital of Ulundi, staring at a map that had become his obsession and his torment. Outside, 12,000 British and colonial troops waited for orders that would either redeem him or destroy him forever. In 6 months, this same man had presided over the British Empire's most humiliating military disaster in a generation. Now he faced a choice that would have paralyzed lesser commanders. March forward into the heart of Zululand with an army half the size recommended by every military manual, or retreat and let another man claim the victory that might, just might, salvage his shattered reputation. The mathematics were brutally simple. Intelligence reports suggested King Cetshwayo could field 60,000 warriors, perhaps more. Chelmsford had 12,000 men, many of them exhausted from months of campaigning through hostile terrain. His supply lines stretched perilously thin across 150 miles of African wilderness. His political masters in London had already dispatched his replacement, who was sailing toward Cape Town at that very moment. The new commander, Sir Garnet Wolseley, carried explicit orders to assume control and, everyone knew, to ensure Chelmsford never commanded in the field again. Chelmsford had perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3 if fortune smiled. After that, Wolseley would arrive, and history would record that Lord Chelmsford had been the general who lost Isandlwana. The catastrophic defeat where 300 British and colonial troops were annihilated by Zulu warriors in a battle that should never have been lost, and nothing more. His legacy would be failure. His name would become a cautionary tale taught at military academies. The general who underestimated his enemy, divided his forces, and paid the ultimate price. But if he could destroy the Zulu army's main impi at Ulundi before Wolseley arrived, if he could capture or force the surrender of King Cetshwayo, if he could do what everyone said was impossible, win a decisive victory against overwhelming odds in the enemy's heartland, then maybe, just maybe, people would remember him for something other than Isandlwana. This wasn't just about military strategy. This was about redemption. This was about a 52-year-old career officer who had spent 3 decades climbing through the ranks of the British Army, who had commanded in India and Abyssinia, who had been given the most important colonial assignment of the decade, the subjugation of the powerful Zulu kingdom, and who had spectacularly failed when it mattered most. On January 22nd, 1879, at a place called Isandlwana, Zulu warriors had overwhelmed his divided forces and killed more British soldiers in a single afternoon than had died in any colonial battle since the First Afghan War, nearly 40 years earlier. The disaster had shocked London, outraged Parliament, and left Chelmsford's military career hanging by the thinnest of threads. Now he sat 30 miles from Ulundi, the Zulu capital, with an army that was too small, supply lines that were too long, and time that was running out. Intelligence scouts reported that King Cetshwayo was gathering every warrior he could muster for a final, decisive confrontation. The Zulu nation, proud and powerful, had already proven they could destroy a British column. Now they would defend their heartland with everything they had. The safe choice was obvious. Consolidate his position, wait for reinforcements, hand command over to Wolseley when he arrived, and let fresh leadership finish the campaign. The British Empire had time. It had resources. It had the industrial capacity to ship another 10,000 troops to South Africa if necessary. Patience was the prudent path. But patience meant disgrace. Patience meant Chelmsford's name would be forever synonymous with Isandlwana. Patience meant watching another general claim the victory while he sailed home in shame to face a court of inquiry that would dissect every decision he'd made that terrible day in January. So there was no real choice at all. He would march on Ulundi. He would force a battle. He would stake everything, his career, his reputation, his men's lives, on one desperate throw of the dice. And he would do it using tactical innovations that would revolutionize colonial warfare, but which at this moment existed only in his mind and in his determination to never, ever repeat the mistakes of Izandlwana. What happened in the following weeks would become one of the most extraordinary tactical achievements in the history of colonial warfare. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Chelmsford's victory at Ulundi represents the most perfect execution of defensive square tactics ever recorded, why it saved the British from another potential disaster, and why, despite its brilliance, it has been somehow forgotten by everyone except military historians who study the evolution of infantry tactics. You'll see how one man transformed humiliation into triumph through a combination of meticulous planning, iron discipline, and tactical innovation that emerged directly from catastrophic failure. And you'll discover why this battle, which decisively ended the Anglo-Zulu War in a single afternoon, deserves to stand alongside Wellington's victories as a masterpiece of military command under impossible pressure. But the road to Ulundi began not in July 1879, but 18 months earlier, in the corridors of power in Cape Town and London, where imperial ambitions and colonial politics set in motion a conflict that nobody truly wanted, but everyone seemed powerless to stop. But we can't just jump straight to the climactic battle at Ulundi. Without understanding the context, the political machinations, the strategic miscalculations, and the complex relationship between the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom, you can't possibly grasp why Chelmsford found himself in such a desperate position, or why his victory mattered so much. The story begins not with war, but with confederation. In 1877, the British Empire controlled vast territories in southern Africa, but they were fragmented, disorganized, and expensive to maintain. The Cape Colony, Natal, the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, Griqualand West, each had its own administration, its own policies, its own conflicts with indigenous peoples. The Colonial Office in London, always concerned about costs and efficiency, believed the solution was confederation, unite these territories under a single government, as Canada had been united a decade earlier. One administration meant one military, one native policy, and, most importantly, one budget to manage instead of half a dozen. The architect of this plan was Sir Henry Bartle Frere, appointed High Commissioner for Southern Africa in March 1877. Frere was 62 years old, a veteran colonial administrator who had served with distinction in India and a true believer in the civilizing mission of the British Empire. He was also stubborn, supremely confident in his own judgment, and willing to interpret his instructions from London with considerable creative latitude. Frere identified the major obstacle to confederation almost immediately: the Zulu Kingdom. The Zulus, under King Cetshwayo Kampande, controlled approximately 10,000 square miles of territory between Natal and the Transvaal. Their kingdom was one of the most powerful indigenous states in southern Africa, with a population approaching 250,000 people. More significantly, they maintained a military system that could field approximately 40,000 to 50,000 warriors organized in age-based regiments called Amabutho. These weren't mere tribal militia. They were disciplined, trained soldiers who had perfected tactics over decades of warfare, capable of moving at extraordinary speeds and executing complex battlefield maneuvers. The Zulu military system, inherited and refined from the great King Shaka in the early 19th century, was fundamentally different from European armies. Young men joined age regiments in their late teens and remained with that regiment for life. They lived in military kraals, trained constantly, and could not marry until their regiment had washed its spears in battle and the king granted permission. This created a large population of unmarried warriors in their 20s and 30s, physically fit, highly motivated, and eager to prove themselves in combat. From Frere's perspective, the Zulu kingdom represented an unacceptable threat. As long as 40,000 Zulu warriors existed as an organized military force on Natal's border, the colony would never feel secure. British settlers in Natal, numbering only about 18,000 whites among a population of 300,000 Africans, lived in constant awareness that a powerful military state sat just across the Tugela River. The Transvaal Boers, recently brought under British control in April 1877, had their own long-standing territorial disputes with the Zulus. Confederation could not succeed, Frere believed, while this regional military power remained independent and strong. But there was a problem. The Zulus hadn't actually done anything to justify war. King Cetshwayo, crowned in 1873 with British approval and recognition, had been a generally peaceful neighbor. Yes, there were border disputes. There always were border disputes in colonial Africa. Yes, the Zulu military system made British colonists nervous. Yes, Cetshwayo occasionally executed subjects for witchcraft or political disloyalty, which shocked Victorian sensibilities. But the Zulus hadn't invaded Natal. They hadn't massacred British subjects. They hadn't done anything that would justify what Frere wanted to do: dismantle their military system and bring them under British control. So Frere created a crisis. In July 1878, two minor border incidents occurred. In one case, two wives of a Zulu chief fled into Natal to escape punishment. Zulu authorities pursued them across the border and forcibly returned them, a clear violation of British sovereignty, however minor. In another incident, a British surveyor and several others were briefly detained by Zulu authorities while working near the disputed border. These were trivial incidents, the kind of minor border friction that happened constantly in colonial settings and were typically resolved through diplomatic channels. Frere seized on them as casus belli. He established a boundary commission to investigate all outstanding disputes between Natal and the Zulu kingdom. The commission, predictably, found largely in favor of the Zulus on the major territorial question. The disputed land actually belonged to Cetshwayo, not to the Transvaal Boers, who claimed it. This should have de-escalated tensions. Instead, Frere buried the Boundary Commission's findings and used its work as a pretense to issue an ultimatum. On December 11, 1878, at a dramatic meeting under a large fig tree near the lower Tugela River, British representatives read out Frere's demands to Zulu emissaries. The terms were designed to be unacceptable. Among other requirements, Cetshwayo must surrender the men responsible for the border violations for trial, pay a fine of 500 cattle, accept a British resident in Zululand, disband the Amabutho military system within 30 days, allow Zulu men to marry freely without the king's permission. Read that third-to-last demand again. Disband the Amabutho within 30 days. This wasn't a diplomatic requirement. It was an impossible demand. The Amabutho system was the foundation of Zulu society, culture, economy, and political organization. It had existed for 60 years. Asking Cetshwayo to dismantle it in 30 days was like asking Britain to abolish Parliament in a month. It couldn't be done, and everyone knew it. That was precisely the point. Frere wanted war. He believed, genuinely believed, that the Zulu military system represented an intolerable threat to British interests, and that confederation required eliminating this threat. He also believed, with the supreme confidence that characterized British imperial thinking in the 1870s, that British regulars would easily defeat any number of native warriors. After all, hadn't tiny British forces consistently defeated numerically superior indigenous armies across Africa and Asia? Hadn't technology, rifles, artillery, discipline proven decisive again and again? What Frere didn't fully appreciate was that the Zulus were different. They had fought Europeans before. They had developed tactics specifically designed to counter firepower advantages. They moved with incredible speed. A Zulu impi could cover 50 miles in a day when European columns managed perhaps 10. Their traditional horns of the buffalo tactic, a center that fixed the enemy in place while two wings encircled and enveloped them, was sophisticated and devastating. And they had something else: courage, discipline, and a warrior culture that embraced close combat. Cetshwayo received the ultimatum with dismay. He consulted with his indunas, his senior advisors and military commanders. The consensus was clear. They could not comply with the demand to disband the Amabutho, but they also could not defeat the British Empire in a prolonged war. The king attempted diplomatic solutions, sending messengers to request negotiations, offering to pay the cattle fine, promising to hand over the border violators. It was too late. The ultimatum expired on January 11th, 1879, and Frere had already given Chelmsford orders to invade. And that's exactly what terrified everyone who understood the reality of the situation. Britain was about to fight a war. It didn't need to fight, against an enemy that didn't want to fight, using an army that wasn't adequately prepared, commanded by a general who had never faced an opponent like the Zulus. The British government in London, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli and Colonial Secretary Sir Michael Hicks Beach, had not authorized this war. In fact, they had explicitly told Frere not to start a war without prior approval. But by the time London learned what Frere had done, British columns were already crossing into Zululand, and the Empire's prestige was committed. The stage was set for disaster. There was one man who thought he could win this war quickly and decisively, Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford. Frederick Augustus. Thesiger had been born into military aristocracy in 1827. His father was a distinguished lawyer who became Lord Chancellor. His family connections extended throughout the highest levels of British society. Young Frederick joined the Rifle Brigade in 1844 at age 17 and spent the next 34 years climbing steadily through the ranks. He served in the Crimean War. Though he saw little action, he commanded the expedition that captured Magdala in Abyssinia in 1868, a campaign considered a masterpiece of logistics that earned him a promotion to lieutenant general. He was methodical, careful, popular with his officers, and had a reputation for thorough planning. He was also, by 1878, a product of his era's military thinking, which would prove catastrophic. Chelmsford arrived in South Africa in 1878 to command British forces in the region. When Frere decided to force war with the Zulus, Chelmsford became the instrument of that policy. He spent months planning the invasion, and his plan reflected conventional military wisdom. Divide your forces to advance on multiple fronts, threatening the enemy capital from several directions, forcing them to divide their own forces in response. Chelmsford organized his army into 5 columns totaling approximately 16,800 men, a mix of British regulars, colonial volunteers, and African auxiliaries. The main force, which Chelmsford personally commanded, would cross the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift and advance directly toward Ulundi, approximately 80 miles distant. Other columns would enter Zululand from different directions, threatening Zulu territory and theoretically preventing Cetshwayo from concentrating all his forces against any single column. The plan looked impressive on maps. It was exactly the kind of methodical, professional campaign that military academies taught. It had one fatal flaw. It assumed the enemy would react as European armies reacted. On January 11, 1879, Chelmsford's main column crossed into Zululand. It consisted of approximately 4,700 troops, including the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 24th Regiment, the South Wales Borderers, Colonial Mounted Infantry, African Auxiliary Forces, and supporting artillery. The column moved slowly, 10 miles in 4 days, slowed by its enormous baggage train of 220 wagons. Chelmsford established a camp at the base of a distinctive mountain called Isandlwana and began scouting operations to locate the main Zulu army. What happened next would haunt Chelmsford for the rest of his life. On January 21st, reports reached Chelmsford that Zulu forces had been spotted approximately 10 miles from the camp. Despite having no concrete intelligence about the main Zulu army's location, Chelmsford made a fateful decision. He would personally lead roughly half his force, approximately 2,500 men, on a night march to engage these reported Zulu forces. He left the camp at Isandlwana, defended by approximately 1,300 men under the command of Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline, with orders to defend the camp and complete the entrenchment work. Chelmsford took the trained regulars of the 24th Regiment with him. He left behind a patchwork force of various companies, colonial volunteers, and African auxiliaries. More critically, he took almost all the mounted troops, the cavalry that could scout, provide early warning, and screen a position. The camp at Isandlwana was left exposed, unable to see threats approaching through the broken terrain. On the morning of January 22nd, while Chelmsford was miles away chasing phantom reports of Zulu forces, the main Zulu army, approximately 20,000 warriors, approached Isandlwana from the north. They had been hiding in the Ingwebeni Valley, concealed by the terrain, waiting for an opportunity. 2 British cavalry scouts accidentally discovered them, and the Zulu commanders made the instant decision to attack, even though it was the day of the new moon, considered unlucky for battle. What followed was catastrophe. The Zulus attacked in their traditional formation, a center to fix the enemy, and 2 horns that swept around both flanks to encircle the position. The British and colonial troops at Isandlwana fought with desperate courage. The 24th Regiment fired disciplined volleys that cut down attacking warriors by the hundreds. Colonial volunteers held their positions until ammunition ran low. African auxiliaries defended their sectors until they were overwhelmed. But Pauline had been left in an impossible position. His force was too small to defend the entire perimeter of the camp. He had no cavalry to scout or harry the Zulu flanks. The camp was not entrenched. Chelmsford had ordered it fortified, but the work was incomplete. As the Zulu horns extended around both flanks, the defensive line had to stretch further and further until gaps appeared. When ammunition began running low, a supply problem that remains controversial among historians, individual companies found themselves fighting without support. By early afternoon, the Zulu horns had completely encircled the camp. What had been a defensive position became a killing ground. Companies of the 24th fought back-to-back as warriors, closed in with Assegai and Knobkerry. Colonial volunteers tried to escape toward Rorke's Drift, but were run down by pursuing Zulus. Of the approximately 1,300 men left at Isandlwana, fewer than 60 Europeans survived. The death toll included over 800 British and colonial troops, the worst British military disaster in decades. Chelmsford heard the sound of heavy firing in the distance that afternoon. He sent staff officers to investigate, but received confused reports. It wasn't until he marched his column back to Isandlwana late that afternoon that he discovered the truth. The camp had been completely destroyed. Bodies lay everywhere. Wagons had been looted and burned. The Zulu army had won a stunning, complete victory. That night, Chelmsford's surviving force sheltered among the ruins of Isandlwana, while Zulu warriors celebrated their victory in the hills surrounding the battlefield. The general, who had been supremely confident just 2 days earlier, now faced the very real possibility that his entire force might be annihilated. The news of Isandlwana, when it reached Britain 2 weeks later, shocked the nation. Newspapers demanded answers. Parliament held emergency sessions. Queen Victoria was reported to be deeply distressed. Chelmsford's military career hung by a thread. The only thing that saved him from immediate dismissal was a second battle fought that same day. At Rorke's Drift, a small mission station on the Buffalo River, approximately 150 British soldiers, many of them sick or recovering from injury, had been left to guard a supply depot. That evening, approximately 4,000 Zulu warriors from the reserve impi that hadn't participated at Isandlwana attacked the station. In an epic 12-hour defense that would become legendary, the British garrison held out through the night, fighting off repeated attacks. By morning, the Zulus withdrew, leaving behind approximately 350 to 500 dead. The British had suffered 17 killed. The defense of Rorke's Drift provided a desperately needed heroic story to partially offset the disaster of Isandlwana. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded to defenders, the most ever awarded for a single engagement. The British press celebrated the heroism while largely ignoring the strategic failure that had made the defense necessary in the first place. But Chelmsford knew the truth. He had divided his forces in the presence of the enemy, the cardinal sin of military command. He had left an exposed camp with inadequate force to defend it. He had gone chasing minor Zulu detachments while the main enemy army destroyed his base, and 800 men had died because of his decisions. The British government immediately sent reinforcements: 5 additional infantry battalions, 2 cavalry regiments, artillery batteries. They also sent Chelmsford's replacement, Major General Sir Garnet Wolseley, one of Britain's most respected commanders, with explicit orders to take command and finish the campaign. The subtext was clear. Chelmsford had failed, and London had no confidence in his ability to complete the mission. But there was a problem with time and distance. Wolseley had to travel from England to Cape Town, a voyage of 3 to 4 weeks, and then overland to Natal, another week or more. Reinforcements had to be organized, equipped, and transported to South Africa. Supplies had to be accumulated. Transport had to be arranged. It would take months before the British could launch a new invasion. Those months gave Chelmsford a chance at redemption. By March 1879, reinforcements began arriving in Natal. Chelmsford reorganized his forces and began planning a new invasion, this time with overwhelming force and meticulous attention to the lessons learned at Isandlwana. He would not divide his forces. He would ensure every camp was fortified. He would maintain cavalry screens at all times. He would never again underestimate the Zulu enemy. He also faced a ticking clock. Wolseley had left England in late May. He would arrive in Cape Town in late June, then travel to Natal. Chelmsford had perhaps 6 to 8 weeks to win the war before his replacement arrived to take command and credit. The race was on. By June 1879, Chelmsford had consolidated a powerful force at his forward base at Ntonjaneni. The 2nd Division consisted of approximately 4,200 British regular infantry from the 17th Lancers, 58th, 80th, and 94th Regiments, plus artillery and engineers. The Flying Column added another 3,500 infantry from the 90th and 91st Regiments, more cavalry, and colonial mounted units. Including transport drivers, African auxiliaries, and support personnel, the total force numbered approximately 12,000 men, the largest British army to operate in southern Africa up to that point. Chelmsford's plan was straightforward: march directly on Ulundi, force the Zulu army to fight a decisive battle, and destroy their military power in one overwhelming engagement. Intelligence indicated that King Cetshwayo had concentrated the bulk of the Zulu army near the capital, perhaps 40,000 to 60,000 warriors, representing nearly all the available Amabutho regiments. This was exactly what Chelmsford wanted: one battle, one decisive victory, and then, perhaps, redemption. But first, he had to figure out how to prevent Isandlwana from happening again. The problem that consumed Chelmsford's thinking in those weeks before the final advance was brutally simple. How do you fight a numerically superior enemy that moves faster than you, attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, and has already proven it can destroy a British column? Let's understand exactly what Chelmsford faced. First, the numerical disadvantage. Intelligence reports, gathered from spies, captured Zulus, and sympathetic informants, suggested the main Zulu impi near Ulundi numbered between 40,000 and 60,000 warriors. Chelmsford's effective combat force numbered approximately 5,400 British infantry, 1,000 colonial mounted infantry, and several hundred African auxiliaries willing to fight, perhaps 7,000 combat-effective troops total. The other 5,000 men in his column were transport drivers, medical personnel, engineers, and support staff. In a battle, he would be outnumbered somewhere between 6 to 1 and 8 to 1. Second, the mobility problem. A Zulu impi could move at extraordinary speeds. Warriors carried minimal equipment, typically just weapons, a sleeping mat, and perhaps a day's rations of ground corn. They could cover 40 to 50 miles in a day when necessary. By contrast, Chelmsford's column moved with 220 supply wagons pulled by oxen. On a good day, with no opposition, the column might manage 10 miles. With the entire Zulu army watching his approach, scouts reported that warriors were shadowing the British advance, staying just out of rifle range, observing, waiting for an opportunity. Third, the tactical challenge. The Zulus had perfected their horns of the buffalo tactic over decades. The center, called Otsaiatord, the chest, would pin the enemy in place with frontal attacks. Meanwhile, the horns, fast-moving wings that could number 10,000 warriors each, would sweep around both flanks to encircle and crush the enemy from behind. At Isandlwana, this tactic had been devastatingly effective. The British had formed traditional European firing lines, and the Zulu horns had simply flowed around them like water around a rock. Fourth, the terrain. The route to Ulundi crossed open grassland broken by occasional gullies and dongas, dry streambeds. There were few natural defensive positions, no convenient hilltops or river crossings that would canalize an attacker. Wherever Chelmsford chose to fight, he would be exposed on relatively flat, open ground where the Zulu mobility advantage would be maximized. Fifth, the supply problem. Every day in enemy territory consumed tons of supplies, food for 12,000 men, fodder for hundreds of horses and oxen, ammunition, medical supplies, and spare parts. The supply line stretched 150 miles back to the coast. Zulu raiders could strike the line at any point. If supplies were interrupted, the army would be forced to retreat. Cetshwayo didn't have to destroy the British army. He just had to prevent it from achieving victory until logistics forced a withdrawal. Sixth, the psychological burden. Every man in Chelmsford's army knew about Isandlwana. They knew that Zulu warriors had overrun trained British regulars. They had heard stories, many exaggerated, some true, about how quickly the Zulus could close to hand fighting, how the traditional assegai, stabbing spear, could kill a man in seconds, how wounded soldiers had been killed where they lay. The Zulu reputation for courage was well established. They did not break easily, did not retreat when fired upon, and pressed attacks home with ferocious determination. Most commanders would have thought victory was impossible. The orthodox approach would have been to wait for Wolseley, consolidate even more reinforcements, perhaps bring in another 10,000 troops, and advance with overwhelming force. But Chelmsford didn't have that time. Wolseley was already en route. In late June, word reached Chelmsford that the new commander-in-chief had landed at Cape Town and was making his way toward Natal. Wolseley was expected to arrive in mid-July, perhaps 2 weeks away. Chelmsford faced a choice between impossible options: retreat and live in disgrace, or advance with insufficient force and risk another disaster. He chose the third option, tactical innovation born from bitter experience: the defensive square. The concept wasn't new. European armies had been forming squares to repel cavalry charges for centuries. Wellington's infantry had used squares to devastating effect at Waterloo against French cavalry. But cavalry and infantry were different threats. Cavalry were vulnerable to concentrated firepower. Horses would balk at charging into massed rifle fire. Infantry, especially infantry willing to take casualties, could potentially force their way into a square through sheer weight of numbers. Chelmsford's innovation was to adapt the square specifically to counter the Zulu tactical system. He would form his entire force, infantry, artillery, cavalry, and even supply wagons, into a massive hollow square. Every side would have its own firing line, its own supporting artillery, its own sectors of responsibility. The Zulus could attack from any direction. Every attack would face the same concentrated firepower. The horns of the buffalo couldn't envelop what was already prepared in all directions. But this required solving multiple technical problems. First, the square had to be large enough to contain thousands of troops plus their supply wagons and equipment, yet tight enough that every sector could support its neighbors with flanking fire. Too large, and the perimeter would be too thin to stop determined attacks. Too small, and the interior would be too crowded to maneuver. Second, the square had to move. It couldn't be a static defensive position. Chelmsford needed to advance toward Ulundi, force a battle, and maneuver if necessary. This meant the square had to maintain formation while crossing broken terrain, fording streams, and navigating obstacles, something no British force had ever attempted at this scale. Third, every soldier had to understand his exact position and responsibility in the chaos of battle, with warriors attacking from all sides, with smoke obscuring vision and noise drowning commands. Individual units had to maintain their sectors without constant orders from above. This required intensive training and absolute discipline. Fourth, the cavalry, traditionally used for flanking attacks and pursuit, had to be integrated into a defensive system. How do you use mobile troops in a formation designed to be static? Chelmsford's solution was to position cavalry at the corners of the square where they could sally out to disrupt Zulu formations, then retreat back into the protection of the square's firepower. Fifth, and most critically, the ammunition problem that had contributed to the disaster at Isandlwana had to be solved. At Isandlwana, there had been plenty of ammunition in reserve, but it was packed in wooden crates secured with copper bands and screws. Opening the crates under fire was difficult and time-consuming. Unit quartermasters controlled distribution, and in the chaos of battle, ammunition couldn't be distributed fast enough to frontline troops. Chelmsford mandated that for the advance on Ulundi, every soldier would carry 70 rounds, the maximum that could be comfortably carried, and reserve ammunition wagons would be positioned inside the square where boxes could be pre-opened and rounds distributed immediately when needed. The plan was audacious. It had never been tested. It required perfect execution from thousands of men, many of whom had never fought the Zulus before. If the square broke at any point, if one sector collapsed, the entire formation could be rolled up and destroyed. The Zulus had already proven at Isandlwana that they could exploit any weakness with terrifying speed. Chelmsford was risking everything: his career, his reputation, his army, on a tactical formation that existed only in his planning documents and in the drill practices his officers had conducted over the previous weeks. He was also racing against time. By late June, Chelmsford knew he had perhaps 2 weeks before Wolseley arrived. 2 weeks to advance the final 30 miles to Ulundi. 2 weeks to force a decisive battle. 2 weeks to achieve the victory that would, maybe, let him return to England with his honor intact. On June the 24th, 1879, Chelmsford issued the order to advance. The British column left its base at Entonjaneni on June 24th and began the final march toward the Zulu capital. The formation Chelmsford ordered was unlike anything most of his soldiers had ever experienced. They would march in square from the very beginning. Imagine this: a formation roughly 250 yards per side, creating a hollow rectangle of troops, artillery, and wagons. The front face consisted of the 17th Lancers, the 58th Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the native contingent, and artillery. The left face held the 80th Regiment and the 94th Regiment. The rear face was formed by the 2nd Division Infantry Regiments and more artillery. The right face consisted of the Flying Column Regiments, the 90th and 91st, plus additional colonial units. Inside the square, protected by 4 walls of troops, were the 220 supply wagons, the reserve ammunition, the medical staff, engineers, and headquarters. Every morning, the square formed before dawn. Troops ate breakfast inside the formation. When the order to advance was given, the entire square moved as one gigantic unit, thousands of men maintaining their positions relative to each other while crossing streams, climbing slopes, and traversing broken ground. Cavalry scouts ranged ahead and to the flanks, but always within supporting distance of the square's firepower. If threatened, they could gallop back to the safety of the formation. The advance was painfully slow. Even without enemy action, maintaining formation limited the march to perhaps 5 miles per day. But speed wasn't the goal, security was. After Isandlwana, Chelmsford would never again allow his force to be divided or surprised. And the Zulus were watching. On June 26th, as the column forded the White Mafalotsi River, scouts reported large numbers of Zulu warriors gathering on the hills to the north. These weren't attacks, they were observations. King Cetshwayo's commanders were studying the British formation, looking for weaknesses, reporting back to the capital. Traditional Zulu tactics relied on speed and maneuver, finding a flank to attack, sweeping around to encircle. The square offered no flanks. Every direction looked the same: ranks of red-coated infantry, artillery pieces, and massed firepower. That evening, the British made camp in their square formation. Chelmsford ordered entrenchments dug on all 4 sides, shallow but sufficient to provide some protection. Artillery was positioned at the corners, creating interlocking fields of fire. Outposts were established beyond the square's perimeter, close enough to retreat but enough to provide early warning. The entire camp bristled with preparation, nothing like the exposed position at Isandlwana. Intelligence reports arrived through sympathetic Zulus and captured scouts. King Cetshwayo had summoned every available regiment to Ulundi. The main impi was gathering. Estimates ranged from 40,000 to 60,000 warriors. The king's senior commanders were divided in their council. Some argued for patience, letting the British supply lines stretch until logistics forced a retreat. Others wanted immediate battle, to destroy the British as they had at Isandlwana, to prove the Zulu military system could defeat European invaders. The king himself reportedly vacillated, seeking guidance from his diviners and senior indunas. On June the 28th, the column advanced another 5 miles. They were now less than 20 miles from Ulundi. The landscape changed subtly. The hills grew more defined, the valleys deeper. This was the Zulu heartland, the territory around the king's principal corrals. Every warrior in the Zulu army knew this ground intimately. That night, Chelmsford called his senior officers together for final planning. The mood in the headquarters tent was tense but determined. Everyone understood what was coming. The next few days would determine not just the outcome of the campaign, but potentially the fate of everyone in the square. Chelmsford reviewed the plan one final time. When battle came, and it would come probably within days, the square would halt, face outward, and hold position. No unit would break formation to pursue fleeing warriors. No heroic charges to finish them off. The only objective was to survive the Zulu attack and kill enough warriors that the Zulu military will would be broken. Artillery would fire canister shot and shrapnel into massed formations. Infantry would fire controlled volleys at any range under 300 yards. The Gatling guns, new machine weapons that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, would sweep the front, creating killing zones that no human courage could cross. It sounded straightforward in the tent, but everyone knew that battle rarely went according to plan. The Zulus had already proven they could adapt to British tactics. They had demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire, and they would be fighting for their homeland, their king, and their way of life. The next morning, June 29th, the column advanced again. By afternoon, they had reached the Ulundi Basin, a relatively flat area of grassland approximately 6 miles from the Zulu capital. Scouts reported massive concentrations of warriors visible on the surrounding ridges. The entire Zulu army was gathering, just out of rifle range, watching and waiting. Chelmsford made the crucial decision. They would camp here tonight and fight tomorrow. The ground was suitable, open, enough for clear fields of fire, firm enough for artillery and cavalry maneuvers. A small stream provided water. The surrounding terrain offered no particular advantages to the Zulus. Wherever they attacked from, they would have to cross open ground under fire. That night was surreal. In the British square, 12,000 men prepared for battle. Soldiers cleaned their rifles, organized their ammunition pouches, wrote letters home that might never be sent. Officers checked and rechecked their sector assignments. Artillerymen positioned their guns with mathematical precision. Cavalry troopers tended their horses and sharpened their sabers. Outside the square, across the dark grassland, campfires glowed on the hills where 40,000 or more Zulu warriors prepared for the coming battle. They danced the war dances, singing songs that had been sung by their fathers and grandfathers. They performed rituals that dated back to Shaka's time. They prepared mentally for what every warrior knew could be his last day. And they prepared to do honor to their king, their regiment, and their ancestors. July 3rd, 1879 dawned clear and hot. The sun rose over a landscape that was about to witness one of history's most one-sided battles. But nobody in the British square knew that yet. What they knew was that somewhere beyond their perimeter, the largest Zulu army ever assembled was preparing to attack. And then, nothing happened. The morning passed in tense silence. Noon came and went. Chelmsford waited. The Zulus did not attack. By early afternoon, it became clear that King Cetshwayo was not going to oblige the British by launching an assault against their prepared position. The Zulu strategy was patience. Let the British exhaust their supplies, force them to retreat, and attack during the withdrawal when the formation was necessarily more vulnerable. Chelmsford faced his final, desperate decision. He could not afford to wait. Every day consumed supplies that were not easily replaced. More importantly, Wolseley was coming, might already be in Natal, might arrive any day. If Chelmsford waited and was superseded before a decisive battle, the entire campaign, the entire march, would have been for nothing. On the evening of July the 3rd, Chelmsford made his choice. Tomorrow, July 4th, he would march directly on Ulundi with the square formation. He would present the Zulu army with a choice: attack the square or watch while British troops burned the royal kraals. He would force the battle on his terms, with his troops in their prepared formation, or he would destroy the symbols of Zulu sovereignty and make the war unwinnable for Cetshwayo. It was a desperate gamble, but Chelmsford was out of safe options. Tomorrow would bring redemption or disaster. There would be no middle ground. The time had come. Dawn broke over the Ulundi Basin at 6:15 a.m. on July 4th, 1879. The British force had been awake since 4:30 a.m., preparing for a day that would decide everything. Soldiers ate a hurried breakfast of hardtack and tea. Officers checked their men's ammunition, 70 rounds per soldier as ordered, with reserve boxes already opened and placed in wagons inside the square. Artillery crews cleaned their guns' barrels one final time. The 17th Lancers saddled their horses in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Chelmsford stood with his staff, watching the hills surrounding the basin. Somewhere beyond his sight, the Zulu army was gathering. Scouts had reported massive movement during the night, regiments converging from their separate encampments, forming into the traditional pre-battle formation. Intelligence suggested the Zulus would field approximately 40,000 warriors, organized into 15 to 20 separate Amabutha regiments, each with its own history, reputation, and fighting style. At 6:45 a.m., the order was given. The British force would advance in square directly toward Ulundi. The formation that began moving across the grassland was a military engineer's masterpiece of coordination. The front face, facing northeast toward Ulundi, consisted of the 58th Regiment, 4 companies, approximately 400 men, on the left. The 80th Regiment, 5 companies, approximately 500 men, in the center, and the 94th Regiment, 4 companies, approximately 400 men, on the right. 2 9-pound artillery pieces were positioned slightly forward of the line, able to fire directly ahead. The 17th Lancers, mounted cavalry, formed up in front of the square, ready to screen the advance. The left face was held by the 13th and 24th Companies of British regulars, approximately 350 men total. The rear face contained the 2nd Division regiments, another 800 men, with 2 more artillery pieces positioned at the rear corners. The right face consisted of the 90th and 91st regiments from the flying column, approximately 900 men, plus colonial mounted infantry and irregular cavalry units. Inside the square's hollow center moved the 220 supply wagons, organized in a mobile lager. Medical staff, engineers, reserve ammunition wagons, and Chelmsford's headquarters traveled in this protected interior. The entire formation covered approximately 6 acres and contained roughly 12,000 men and animals moving in orchestrated precision. The advance was deliberately slow. Chelmsford had ordered a pace that allowed every unit to maintain position, every gap to be immediately closed. The square moved at perhaps 1 mile per hour, a crawl that must have been agonizing for the soldiers who wanted to get the coming battle over with. At 7:30 a.m., as the morning sun climbed higher and burned off the last morning mist, Zulu regiments began appearing on the surrounding hills. The warriors emerged from the broken ground to the north and east in waves of color and motion. Each Amabutho had its own distinctive shield patterns and headdress. The Uthulwana regiment, veteran warriors in their 40s, carrying white shields with black spots, formed up on the northern ridge. The Ingobamakosi, younger men in their 20s, considered one of the most aggressive regiments, assembled to the east. The Umbonambi, the Umchijo, the Udloko, the Ukandempemvu. Regiment after regiment appeared until the hills seemed to boil with movement. British officers with field glasses tried to count the assembling forces. Estimates varied, but everyone agreed. They were vastly outnumbered. One British soldier later wrote that the Zulu army looked like a dense black cloud spreading across the horizon. Another described a living wave of humanity, stretching as far as the eye could see. At 8:15 a.m., Chelmsford halted the square approximately 4 miles from Ulundi. The ground here was ideal for his purposes. Relatively flat grassland with clear fields of fire in all directions and a small tributary of the White Mufalodzi River providing water. The position offered no tactical advantage to either side. It was simply open ground where firepower would determine the outcome. The British square stopped moving. Units dressed their lines, closing any gaps. Artillery crews unlimbered their guns, checked elevations, and prepared ammunition. Infantry companies loaded their Martini Henry rifles, powerful single-shot breech loaders that fired a 5.77-inch bullet capable of killing at 1,000 yards. The distinctive metallic sound of thousands of breech blocks snapping shut echoed across the square. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The Zulu regiments on the surrounding hills continued their final preparations. They sang war songs. They performed the Gia, the ritual stomping dance that prepared warriors mentally for battle. They checked their weapons. The Ikulwa, short stabbing spear, several throwing spears, knob-carry clubs, and for some, antiquated muskets and rifles captured in previous conflicts or purchased from traders. Chelmsford used this time to make final adjustments. He positioned his cavalry at the corners of the square, where they could most effectively sally out if needed. He confirmed with his artillery commanders that they had clear fields of fire to every direction. He sent staff officers to each face of the square with explicit orders. No unit would break formation under any circumstances, no pursuit of fleeing enemies, controlled volley fire only. The British soldiers waited. Many had fought in colonial wars before, India, Abyssinia, Afghanistan. But nothing prepared them for the sight of a Zulu army assembling for battle. The scale was overwhelming. The coordination was frightening. These weren't disorganized raiders or tribal militia. These were disciplined military units, tens of thousands strong, preparing to execute tactics that had destroyed armies before. At 8:45 a.m., the Zulu army began to move. The attack developed exactly as Zulu military doctrine prescribed, the classic horns of the buffalo formation, adapted to the scale of the assembled force. The chest, the main body consisting of approximately 15,000 warriors from the Uthulwana, Ukandempemvu, and other veteran regiments, formed up directly north of the British square. These were older warriors, men in their 30s and 40s, experienced in battle. Their role was to fix the enemy in place with a frontal assault, to draw attention and firepower while the horns executed the killing maneuver. The right horn, perhaps 12,000 warriors from the younger, faster regiments, including the Bamakosi, swung wide to the east, moving at incredible speed to envelope that side of the square. These warriors jogged in loose formation, covering ground at a pace that shocked British observers. They moved not in straight lines, but in dynamic, flowing groups that adjusted to terrain and obstacles, maintaining cohesion without rigid formation. The left horn, another 12,000 warriors from regiments including the Umchiho and Udoloko, swept around to the west, mirroring the Eastern Horn's movement. The two horns were attempting to encircle the entire British position, to attack from all sides simultaneously, to recreate on a massive scale what had worked so devastatingly at Isandlwana. Inside the British square, officers shouted orders. "Steady, men! Hold your positions! Wait for the order to fire!" At 9 a.m., at approximately 800 yards distance, the Zulu chest began its advance. The warriors moved forward in a massive wave, not marching in step like European soldiers, but flowing across the grassland in a coordinated rush. They carried their shields in their left hands, spears in their right. Some had rifles and began firing from extreme range, wildly inaccurate at that distance, but the psychological effect of thousands of gunshots was considerable. Chelmsford's artillery commanders waited, calculating range and elevation. At 600 yards, they opened fire. The boom of the 9-pound guns shattered the morning air. Shells screamed overhead and exploded in the midst of the advancing warriors. Each shell contained shrapnel balls that sprayed outward in a deadly cone, cutting down anyone within 20 yards of the explosion. The Zulus had faced artillery before, but never in such concentration. Every corner of the square had at least one gun, and the artillery crews were experienced professionals who could reload and fire 3 rounds per minute. The warriors barely slowed. This was the test of the Zulu military system, the courage, discipline, and commitment drilled into young men from childhood. You advanced. You closed with the enemy. You killed or you died, but you advanced. Warriors fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds as artillery fire found the range. The advancing line developed gaps where shells had torn through densely packed groups, but the gaps closed immediately as warriors from the rear ranks moved forward to fill them. At 400 yards, the British infantry opened fire. The Martini Henry rifle was a formidable weapon. It fired a heavy 5.77-inch bullet at approximately 400 feet per second. At 400 yards, the bullet retained enough energy to kill with a hit anywhere on the torso. More importantly, the Martini Henry could be fired at a sustained rate of approximately 12 aimed shots per minute by a trained soldier. With approximately 5,400 infantry in the square, all facing outward, the theoretical rate of fire was staggering, over 60,000 rounds per minute if every soldier fired continuously. The reality was more measured. British officers had drilled controlled volley fire into their men obsessively. Companies fired by half companies. One section fired while the other reloaded. This created a continuous, rolling fire that never left a sector without loaded rifles. The sound was distinctive, not one massive volley, but a continuous crackling roar like enormous sheets of canvas being torn endlessly. The effect on the advancing Zulu warriors was catastrophic. At Isandlwana, Zulu warriors had faced rifle fire from a thin defensive line. Here, they faced concentrated fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Warriors in the chest fell by the hundreds. The grass in front of the square's northern face became littered with bodies. Still they came on, stepping over their fallen comrades, maintaining the advance through courage and discipline that bordered on the superhuman. But the square held. At 9:15 a.m., the Zulu horns reached the flanks of the square. The right horn, attacking from the east, hit the square's right face, the 90th and 91st Regiments, plus colonial cavalry. These warriors were younger, faster, less experienced, but more aggressive than the chest regiments. They closed to within 200 yards before the concentrated rifle fire became unbearable. Warriors attempted to take cover in the scattered rocks and anthills that dotted the grassland. They fired their own guns and rifles. Perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 firearms were in Zulu hands, though most were antiquated and ammunition was limited. Return fire from Zulu positions was scattered and largely ineffective, but it demonstrated that these warriors were not simply charging blindly to their deaths. They were attempting tactical maneuvers under impossible conditions. The left horn, attacking from the west, faced the 13th and 24th Company formations. These warriors encountered the same wall of fire, the same devastating results. Some warriors made it to within 100 yards before being cut down. At that range, every shot killed. There was no cover, no way to avoid the fire. Warriors fell in groups, cut down by volleys that arrived with mechanical precision every few seconds. At 9:25 a.m., the Zulu commanders made their critical decision: commit everything to one massive final push. The reserve regiments, perhaps 10,000 warriors who had been held back as a tactical reserve, now joined the assault. Every regiment, every warrior would attack simultaneously from all directions. The Zulu battle plan was clear: either break through the British square through sheer weight of numbers or die trying. For 5 minutes, the battle reached its absolute peak of intensity. Picture this: a hollow square, 250 yards on each side, containing 12,000 men and their equipment, surrounded on all sides by 40,000 warriors, attempting to close to hand-to-hand combat. The noise was indescribable. The artillery boomed continuously. 5,000 rifles crackled without pause. Zulu war cries, the battle yell, "Usuthu!" echoed across the field. Wounded men screamed. Officers shouted orders that could barely be heard over the din. The northern face of the square faced the heaviest pressure. The Ulundi regiment, veteran warriors, many of whom had fought in previous campaigns, made a concentrated push toward the 58th and 80th regiments. These warriors advanced in loose order, using every scrap of cover, coordinating their movements with sophisticated hand signals and shouted commands. They were attempting to suppress the British fire long enough to close to spear range. It was doomed from the start, but the attempt was magnificent in its courage. Warriors made it to within 50 yards of the square. At that range, they could see individual British soldiers, could identify officers by their uniforms, could aim their own guns with some hope of accuracy. A few warriors made it closer, 40 yards, 30 yards. These were extraordinary individuals, driven by courage or rage or desperation, who advanced through fire that should have been impossible to survive. None reached the British line. The mathematics was simply too brutal. At 30 yards, a Martini Henry rifle could not miss. Every trigger pull killed a man. The riflemen in the front rank fired, stepped back to reload while the second rank stepped forward and fired, creating a seamless rotation that maintained continuous fire. Bodies piled up in rough semicircles in front of each face of the square, marking the high watermark of the Zulu advance. On the eastern face, the Ingobamakosi regiment, young warriors eager to prove themselves, men who had been frustrated by not being allowed to attack at Isandlwana, launched a desperate charge. They came forward in a rush, shields held high, attempting to close the final 100 yards in a sprint that would minimize their exposure to fire. They were fast, incredibly fast. Warriors covered the ground at astonishing speed. The British cavalry, positioned at the corners of the square, saw their opportunity. The 17th Lancers, under the command of Colonel Drury Lowe, requested permission to charge. Chelmsford, watching the battle from inside the square, initially refused. His entire strategy was based on defensive firepower. Cavalry charges were risky, potentially breaking the square's cohesion, but Drury Low pressed. The Zulu warriors were beginning to bunch up, creating a dense target. A cavalry charge could disrupt their assault, buy time for the infantry to reload. Chelmsford reluctantly agreed. One troop, approximately 100 lancers, could charge, but they must return immediately to the square's protection. At 9:35 a.m., the 17th Lancers charged. They burst from the square's eastern corner at a gallop, lances lowered, forming a tight wedge that slammed into the flank of the Ngo-Bamakosi regiment. The impact was devastating. Mounted lancers moving at full gallop represented irresistible momentum. Warriors were knocked down, speared, trampled. The Zulu formation dissolved into chaos as warriors attempted to fight the cavalry while still under fire from the square. But the lancers had underestimated Zulu determination. Warriors grabbed at horses' reins, stabbed upward at riders, attempted to pull men from their saddles. Several lancers were killed in the melee, dragged from their mounts and killed with assegais before their comrades could help. The charge, while successful in disrupting the Zulu assault, nearly turned into disaster as the lancers found themselves surrounded and unable to disengage. Salvation came from the square. The 90th Regiment on the eastern face fired controlled volleys over the heads of the lancers, cutting down warriors attempting to surround the cavalry. The fire was precise, skilled enough to kill warriors within yards of British horsemen without hitting the lancers themselves. It was the kind of disciplined fire control that only veteran troops could achieve. The lancers broke free and galloped back to the square. They had lost 8 men killed and had several wounded, but they had disrupted the most dangerous Zulu assault. The Ngo-Bamakosi regiment, its momentum broken, began to fall back. By 9:40 a.m., the Zulu attack was failing across the entire perimeter. The warriors had given everything. Courage beyond measure, discipline that drove them forward through fire that would have broken most armies, tactical adaptability that showed sophisticated command and control. But they could not overcome the fundamental reality of the situation. Attacking across open ground into concentrated, disciplined rifle fire from multiple directions was simply impossible. The Zulu commanders recognized the situation. Across the battlefield, the withdrawal began. It wasn't a rout. Zulu military culture didn't allow for panicked retreats. Warriors fell back in order, maintaining formation where possible, carrying wounded comrades where feasible. They retreated to the surrounding hills beyond rifle range and began to regroup. The battle had lasted approximately 50 minutes from first contact to withdrawal. In that time, the firepower dynamics of modern warfare had been demonstrated with brutal clarity. Chelmsford ordered his men to hold their positions. There would be no pursuit. The square would maintain its formation, ready to respond if the Zulus attacked again. Officers walked the perimeter, checking casualties, redistributing ammunition, ensuring every sector was prepared. British casualties were remarkably light. 10 men killed, 87 wounded. The defensive square had worked exactly as planned. Wounded men had been immediately carried to the protected interior where medical staff treated them. The dead had fallen while surrounded by comrades who could recover their bodies. No British soldier had been left wounded on the battlefield to face the traditional Zulu practice of washing spears, killing wounded enemies as a ritual. Zulu casualties were catastrophic. Exact numbers are impossible to determine. Zulu military culture didn't keep written records, and bodies were carried away by retreating warriors when possible. British estimates, based on bodies counted on the battlefield and intelligence gathered afterward, ranged from 1,500 to 3,000 killed, with perhaps another 3,000 to 5,000 wounded. These weren't just casualties, they were the finest warriors of the Zulu military system, men in the prime of life, regiment members who represented decades of training and cultural investment. Each death was a father, brother, son. lost. Each casualty was a warrior who would never fight again, never contribute to the Amabutho system that was the foundation of Zulu power. The disparity in casualties, roughly 100 British versus potentially 3,000 Zulu dead and wounded, told the story of the battle more clearly than any after-action report. The defensive square, supported by artillery and equipped with modern rifles, had created a killing zone that human courage alone could not cross. At 10:30 a.m., Chelmsford made his final decision of the campaign. The Zulu army was withdrawing, disorganized and defeated. King Cetshwayo's capital, Ulundi, lay only 4 miles away, now undefended. The British square would advance, occupy the capital, and burn the royal kraals, the ultimate symbol of British victory and Zulu defeat. The square reformed and began to move. This time, there was no Zulu resistance. Warriors watched from distant hills as the British formation advanced inexorably toward Ulundi. The psychological impact was as important as the military result. The Zulu army had committed everything to stopping the British square and had failed completely. By noon, British troops were burning the royal kraals at Ulundi. Smoke rose into the clear African sky, visible for miles in every direction, a signal that the war was effectively over. The Zulu military system, which had seemed so formidable 6 months earlier, had been decisively defeated. King Cetshwayo would be captured weeks later, a fugitive in his own kingdom. The Amabutho regiments would be disbanded as the British ultimatum had demanded. The Zulu nation would be divided into 13 separate territories under British supervision. The Anglo-Zulu War was over, and Lord Chelmsford had his redemption. The British square remained at Ulundi through the afternoon of July 4th. Chelmsford had no intention of occupying the site permanently. He lacked the supply line to support a garrison this deep in Zulu territory, and strategically there was no reason to stay. The burning of the royal kraals accomplished the symbolic objective, demonstrating that British military power could reach anywhere in Zululand, that no position was safe from retaliation. But there were practical matters to address before the army could withdraw. Medical staff worked frantically to treat the wounded. 87 British soldiers had been hit by bullets or stabbing spears, many seriously. Field surgery in 1879 was primitive by modern standards. Doctors worked without anesthesia beyond whiskey and laudanum, without antibiotics, without modern understanding of infection control. Men with abdominal wounds faced terrible odds. Those with limb injuries might face amputation if bleeding couldn't be controlled. Still, the survival rate for wounded British soldiers at Ulundi would be surprisingly high, perhaps 70%, thanks to immediate treatment and rapid evacuation. The burial details faced grimmer work. 10 British soldiers had been killed during the battle. Zulu custom dictated that enemy dead should be mutilated, disemboweled to release the spirit, a practice that horrified Victorian sensibilities but which had significant cultural meaning in Zulu belief systems. However, the fact that no British soldier had died outside the square's protection meant all bodies were recovered intact and could be buried with full military honors. Zulu dead and wounded presented a more complex problem. Bodies lay scattered across the battlefield in rough semicircles marking where each regiment's attack had broken. British officers estimated between 1,500 and 2,000 Zulu dead were visible on the field, though many more had likely been carried away during the retreat. The British made no systematic attempt to bury Zulu dead, a decision that seems callous by modern standards, but which was standard practice in Victorian colonial warfare. African allies and local civilians would handle burials according to their own customs after the British withdrew. As soldiers worked, officers began the process that would define how history remembered the battle: writing reports. Chelmsford's official dispatch, written that evening and sent by mounted courier back toward Natal, was measured but satisfied. He described the Zulu attack as determined and courageous, noted the admirable steadiness of his troops, and praised the effectiveness of the defensive square formation. His prose was careful. He was writing not just military history, but legal defense. Every sentence would be scrutinized by the court of inquiry that would inevitably examine the entire campaign, including Isandlwana. Other officers wrote more personal accounts. Captain Woodgate of the 58th Regiment described the advancing Zulu army as the most magnificent spectacle I have ever witnessed, a moving sea of black warriors stretching to the horizon. Lieutenant Colonel Buller, commanding the Frontier Light Horse, noted, "The Zulus fought with extraordinary courage. They advanced repeatedly into fire that should have broken any troops. That they ultimately failed speaks not to their courage, but to the superiority of our position and weapons." One detail appears in multiple British accounts and deserves emphasis: the respect British officers showed for their defeated enemy. Victorian military culture embraced a particular code that honored brave adversaries even in defeat. Officers repeatedly described Zulu courage, discipline, and tactical skill. They acknowledged that under different circumstances, different terrain, different tactical situation, the outcome might have been very different. This wasn't mere magnanimity. It served a practical purpose. If your enemy was brave and skilled, your victory over them was more impressive, but it also reflected genuine respect for warriors who had fought and died with extraordinary courage. The wounded Zulus presented an ethical dilemma. British medical staff had capacity to treat only their own wounded. Zulu medical practice relied on traditional healers using herbal treatments that British doctors considered worthless, though modern research has validated some traditional African medicine. Wounded Zulu warriors who couldn't retreat with their regiments were left on the battlefield, and British accounts suggest most died over the following days from wounds, exposure, or infection. This reality, leaving enemy wounded to die, was standard practice in 19th century colonial warfare, but it highlights the human cost that military historians often sanitize. Modern readers should understand the 1,500 to 3,000 Zulu dead at Ulundi each represented a person, a young man who had trained as a warrior from childhood, someone's son, perhaps someone's father, a member of a community that would mourn his loss. The British had won a tremendous tactical victory, but the human cost to Zulu society was devastating. By evening on July 4th, Chelmsford ordered the withdrawal to begin. The army would march back to its supply base, maintaining the square formation until clear of potential Zulu attack. The march back took 3 days, slower than the advance because of wounded men requiring careful transport. Scouts reported that Zulu regiments were dispersing, warriors returning to their home districts. The organized military resistance had collapsed. On July 8th, a courier arrived from Natal with news Chelmsford had been dreading. Sir Garnet Wolseley had reached the colony and was marching inland to assume command. The race was over. Chelmsford had won, but barely. Wolseley would arrive in days, perhaps a week. He would take command of a victorious army and receive credit for ending the war, but Chelmsford had achieved what he needed: redemption. He had won the decisive battle, destroyed the Zulu military power, and accomplished the strategic objective of the entire campaign. History could no longer record him only as the general who lost Isandlwana. He was now also the general who won Ulundi. The two men met on July 15th at a small town called St. Paul's. It was, by all accounts, awkward. Wolseley was furious that Chelmsford had preempted him. He had expected to arrive and take command of operations against an intact Zulu army, demonstrating his superior generalship. Instead, he arrived to find the war essentially over, his moment of glory stolen. Chelmsford was coldly polite, formally correct, and clearly relieved to hand over command and responsibility. Wolseley spent the next several weeks mopping up remaining resistance and overseeing the capture of King Cetshwayo, who was found hiding in the Ngome forest on August 28th. The king was treated courteously as a prisoner of war, transported to Cape Town, and eventually exiled to London, where he became something of a celebrity. invited to society functions and photographed for the illustrated papers. Chelmsford sailed for England in September 1879. The reception was mixed. He was not court-martialed. The victory at Ulundi had made that politically impossible. But neither was he celebrated as a hero. A court of inquiry examined the Isandlwana disaster and concluded that mistakes had been made but stopped short of placing direct blame on Chelmsford personally. His military career was effectively over. He would receive no further field commands. He spent his remaining years defending his decisions, writing memoranda and corresponding with officers who had served under him. He died in 1905 at age 78. Still arguing that Isandlwana had been the result of circumstances beyond his control, still insisting that his tactics at Ulundi proved his military competence. History has been more nuanced than Chelmsford might have hoped. He is remembered for both battles, failure and success, inextricably linked. But the true significance of the Battle of Ulundi went far beyond the immediate end of the Anglo-Zulu War or the redemption of one general's reputation. The battle marked a turning point in military history, demonstrating principles that would reshape colonial warfare for decades and revealing truths about military technology that would echo through to World War I and beyond. First, and most immediately, Ulundi marked the effective end of the Zulu kingdom as an independent military power. Within months of the battle, the British colonial administration divided Zululand into 13 separate territories, each under a compliant chief. The Amabutho system was formally disbanded. Unmarried warriors were allowed to marry. Regiments were scattered, and the centralized military structure that had made the Zulu kingdom formidable was dismantled. King Cetshwayo's exile removed the symbolic head of resistance. This fragmentation served British interests perfectly. A unified Zulu kingdom of 250,000 people had represented a genuine threat to colonial expansion. 13 divided chiefdoms, many with long-standing rivalries, posed no serious challenge to British authority. Within a decade, Zululand would be formally annexed to Natal, and Zulu society would be fundamentally transformed by colonial administration, Christianity, labor migration, and economic integration into the British imperial system. Second, Ulundi validated new tactical formations for colonial warfare. The defensive square, as perfected by Chelmsford, became the standard British response to indigenous attacks across Africa. The principle was simple: create a formation that presented equal defensive strength in all directions, maximizing firepower while minimizing vulnerability. Subsequent British campaigns in Sudan, West Africa, and East Africa all employed variations of the Ulundi square when facing numerically superior indigenous forces. The lesson was taught at military academies. When facing mobile enemies willing to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, abandon traditional linear tactics and form squares, artillery at the corners, infantry on all four faces, cavalry ready to sally out and return, supply wagons protected in the interior. This formation became so standard that by the 1890s, British colonial troops could form square under fire within minutes, executing complex maneuvers with minimal orders. Third, Ulundi demonstrated the evolving firepower equation that would dominate warfare through World War I. The Martini-Henry rifle, combined with artillery and, at Ulundi, early Gatling guns, created a killing zone that courage alone could not cross. The mathematics were brutal. Skilled riflemen firing 12 rounds per minute with reasonable accuracy at ranges up to 400 yards created defensive firepower that pre-industrial armies simply could not overcome. This firepower advantage would define colonial warfare for the next 40 years. Tiny British forces, sometimes mere hundreds of troops, could defeat indigenous armies numbering tens of thousands because the technological gap in weapons had become insurmountable. The pattern established at Ulundi repeated across Africa. Omdurman, 1898, where 8,000 British and Egyptian troops defeated 50,000 Mahdist warriors, killing 12,000 for losses of only 47. Adwa, 1896, in Ethiopia, The notable exception where Ethiopian forces equipped with modern rifles defeated Italian colonizers, countless smaller engagements where machine guns and magazine rifles slaughtered spear-armed warriors. Fourth, Ulundi highlighted the psychological dimension of modern warfare. The Zulu warriors at Ulundi weren't cowards or incompetent soldiers. They were highly trained, disciplined, and motivated fighters. They had proven at Isandlwana that they could defeat European troops under favorable circumstances. But at Ulundi, they faced not just superior technology, but superior positioning that maximized British advantages and minimized Zulu strengths. The psychological impact of repeated failed attacks, of watching hundreds of comrades fall while barely scratching the enemy, broke the Zulu military will in a way that battlefield casualties alone might not have. This psychological warfare, the demonstration of overwhelming, unreachable superiority, became a standard component of colonial military strategy. Show the enemy that resistance is futile. Demonstrate that attacking brings only death. Break their will to resist through spectacular displays of firepower. The burning of Ulundi's royal kraals served the same psychological purpose. Nowhere is safe. Resistance is pointless. Submission is the only viable choice. Fifth, Ulundi exposed the limitations of indigenous adaptation to European warfare. The Zulus had studied British tactics after Isandlwana. They knew about rifles and artillery. Some had firearms themselves. They attempted to use cover to coordinate attacks, to employ their traditional tactics of encirclement. But they couldn't bridge the fundamental technology gap. Courage and tactical sophistication couldn't overcome the reality that one side had breech-loading rifles and the other had spears. This exposed a tragic pattern in colonial history. Indigenous societies faced an impossible dilemma. To successfully resist European colonization required adopting European technology, guns, artillery, industrial production. But acquiring that technology required trade with Europeans, which generally meant subordination to European economic systems. Societies that tried to maintain independence while acquiring modern weapons, like the Zulus, found that Europeans controlled both the technology and the supply of ammunition. Societies that embraced European technology typically lost their cultural independence in the process. Sixth, and perhaps most importantly for military history, Ulundi foreshadowed the trench warfare of World War I. The defensive square at Ulundi was essentially a 360-degree trench system, a prepared defensive position where concentrated firepower could repel infantry assault. The lessons were clear. Attacking into concentrated rifle and artillery fire was suicidal. Defensive positions held overwhelming advantages. Courage and elan were useless against modern weapons. These lessons would be forgotten by 1914 with tragic consequences. European armies in World War I would send millions of men charging across open ground into machine gun fire, recreating on vastly larger scale the same pointless slaughter that characterized Zulu attacks at Ulundi. The generals who ordered those attacks at the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele had apparently learned nothing from colonial warfare. Or perhaps they believed different rules applied when fighting other European armies. The Anglo-Zulu War's conclusion also revealed the cynicism of European imperialism. Recall that the war began with Frere's manufactured crisis, the ultimatum designed to be unacceptable, the pretext for destroying an independent African state that had done nothing to justify invasion. The British government in London had explicitly opposed the war, but once British prestige was committed, completion became necessary regardless of the moral questionability of the entire enterprise. This pattern repeated across Africa. Create a crisis, claim provocation, use military superiority to crush resistance, then justify conquest by claiming to bring civilization to supposedly barbaric peoples. The Zulu kingdom, which had maintained internal order, developed sophisticated political institutions, and created a powerful military system without European assistance, was labeled savage and threatening to justify its destruction. Finally, Ulundi demonstrated how individuals, in this case Chelmsford, could shape history through a combination of desperation, skill, and circumstance. Without the humiliation of Isandlwana driving him, would Chelmsford have developed the perfected square formation? Without the pressure of Wolseley's imminent arrival, would he have forced the final confrontation? Without the personal stake of redemption, would he have been as meticulous in his planning? The answer to all these questions is probably no. Chelmsford's greatest military achievement emerged directly from his greatest failure. The tactical innovations that made Ulundi a masterpiece were born from his determination to never repeat Isandlwana's mistakes. His aggressive strategy, marching directly on the Zulu capital rather than waiting for overwhelming force, came from desperate need for victory before being superseded. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Some of history's most significant military innovations emerged not from genius or planning, but from desperation and the need to redeem failure. So why has the Battle of Ulundi, a tactical masterpiece that ended a major colonial war and demonstrated principles that would reshape military thinking, faded from popular memory while other Victorian battles remain famous? The answer involves several interconnected factors that illuminate how military history gets remembered and forgotten. First, the complexity of context works against Ulundi's popular remembrance. The battle was the culmination of a 6-month campaign in a war that most British people didn't support and barely understood. Unlike Waterloo or Trafalgar, battles with clear good versus evil narratives and obvious stakes for British national security, Ulundi was the endpoint of an unnecessary war of conquest. Frere had manufactured the crisis. The British government had opposed the war. The entire enterprise was morally questionable, even by Victorian imperial standards. Popular history prefers simple narratives, plucky underdogs overcoming odds, last stands against evil, clear moral victories. Ulundi offers none of these. It was a technologically superior force defeating a brave but outgunned enemy in a war that shouldn't have happened. That's not the kind of story that generates popular books, films, or commemorations. Second, Ulundi wasn't the final decisive moment it appeared to be. King Cetshwayo wasn't captured at the battle. He remained at large for 7 more weeks. The Zulu kingdom wasn't immediately subdued. It took months of additional operations to enforce British control. Unlike Waterloo, which decisively ended Napoleon's career, or Yorktown, which effectively ended the American Revolution, Ulundi was followed by an extended period of mopping up, negotiation, and administrative reorganization that diluted its dramatic impact. Popular memory gravitates toward clean endings: the surrender at Appomattox, Hitler's suicide in the bunker, the Japanese signing surrender documents on the USS Missouri. Ulundi offered no such moment, just a battle, a burning capital, and then weeks of hunting a fugitive king through wilderness. Third, geographic and cultural distance worked against British popular memory. Zululand was remote. Even by Victorian imperial standards, it was far from the centers of British culture and power. The conflict wasn't covered by journalists as intensely as other colonial wars. No William Howard Russell, the famous Crimean War correspondent, filed daily dispatches that captured public imagination. The Zulus, despite their military achievements, were easier for Victorian Britain to dismiss as savage natives whose defeat was both inevitable and not particularly noteworthy. Compare this to battles in India, another colonial theater, but one with larger British populations, more cultural familiarity, and greater economic importance. The Indian Mutiny of 1857 remained vivid in British memory for generations because it threatened a territory central to British imperial identity. Zululand, by contrast, was strategically marginal, valuable mainly to settlers in Natal, not to Britain as a whole. Fourth, Ulundi was overshadowed by Isandlwana. The disaster in January captured public attention in ways the July victory couldn't match. Heroic defeats are often more memorable than straightforward victories. The slaughter at Isandlwana had everything popular history loves: brave last stands, desperate fighting, tragic deaths of British soldiers far from home. The battle generated investigations, recriminations, and controversy that kept it in the public eye. Ulundi, by contrast, was precisely what military professionals expected. Superior British firepower methodically defeating indigenous warriors. There were no dramatic last stands, no heroic deaths to memorialize. The battle went exactly according to plan, and its very efficiency made it less memorable than the chaotic disaster that preceded it. Fifth, the defense of Rorke's Drift, which occurred the same day as Isandlwana, became the Anglo-Zulu War's defining battle in popular memory. The story had everything. A small garrison, overwhelming odds, desperate defense through the night, heroic courage, multiple Victoria Crosses. The 1964 film, Zulu, ensured that Rorke's Drift would be remembered by generations of viewers who might never have heard of Ulundi or Isandlwana. Rorke's Drift offered the narrative British public wanted. Brave British soldiers defeating savage hordes against impossible odds. Never mind that Rorke's Drift was strategically insignificant and that the garrison wouldn't have been threatened if Chelmsford hadn't divided his forces at Isandlwana. Popular history isn't about strategic analysis, it's about compelling stories, and Rorke's Drift was a far better story than Ulundi's methodical victory. Sixth, military historians' assessment of Ulundi has been mixed in ways that complicate its legacy. Professional soldiers recognized the tactical achievement. The defensive square at Ulundi was studied and emulated. But military theorists also noted that Chelmsford had advantages so overwhelming that victory was essentially guaranteed. He had modern rifles against spears, artillery against flesh, disciplined troops against brave but technologically inferior warriors. What credit does a general deserve for winning a battle where every advantage favored him? This assessment seems unfair. After all, Chelmsford had created those advantages through meticulous planning and had learned from Isandlwana's mistakes. But it reflects a bias in military history. Victories achieved through overwhelming force and careful planning are less celebrated than victories won through daring, creativity, or courage against odds. Wellington is remembered for Waterloo, a close-run thing, more than his numerous Spanish Peninsula victories, most of which were carefully planned applications of superior force. Ulundi fell into this trap. It was too perfect, too methodical, too much the correct outcome. Seventh, the changing scales of warfare diminished Ulundi's significance in retrospect. By World War I standards, just 35 years later, the Battle of Ulundi was tiny. Perhaps 12,000 British troops defeating 40,000 Zulus with 3,000 casualties total. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 would produce 60,000 British casualties in a single day. Verdun would kill 300,000 over 10 months. The entire Anglo-Zulu War's casualties on all sides barely registered, compared to any major WWI battle. This shift in scale retroactively diminished Victorian colonial battles in historical consciousness. What seemed like major military events in the 1880s appeared as mere skirmishes by 1918. The technological gap that made Ulundi possible, modern rifles versus spears, seemed less impressive after Europeans had spent 4 years slaughtering each other with industrial efficiency using machine guns, artillery, poison gas, and aircraft. Eighth, post-colonial historical scholarship complicated the narrative in ways that discouraged celebration. By the mid-20th century, historians began re-examining colonial wars through critical lenses that emphasized imperial aggression, racial injustice, and the tragedy of conquest. Ulundi, viewed through this lens, wasn't a glorious victory. It was a massacre made possible by technological advantages, carried out to conquer an independent African nation that had committed no aggression against Britain. This interpretation is more historically accurate than Victorian celebrations of imperial triumph, but it also makes Ulundi uncomfortable to commemorate. How do you celebrate a battle where your side's victory represented military professionalism applied to an unjust war of conquest? Modern British historians acknowledge Ulundi's tactical brilliance while questioning whether it deserves celebration. Despite these factors that have pushed Ulundi toward historical obscurity, military historians have never forgotten it. The battle remains a case study in defensive tactics, firepower coordination, and the effective integration of different military branches, infantry, cavalry, artillery, into a cohesive defensive system. Staff colleges have studied Chelmsford's square formation for over a century. The principles demonstrated at Ulundi, concentrate firepower, maintain all-around defense, never break formation, remain valid in military doctrine. The battle also retains significance in South African history, though in complicated ways. For Zulu descendants, Ulundi represents both the courage of their ancestors and the tragedy of conquest. The battle is remembered not as British military genius, but as Zulu bravery in the face of impossible odds. Modern Zulu historians emphasize that warriors at Ulundi were defending their homeland against foreign invasion, that their courage under fire demonstrated the strength of Zulu military culture, and that ultimate defeat came from technological disadvantage rather than inferior fighting spirit. This dual memory, British focus on tactical achievement, Zulu focus on resistance and courage, reflects how different communities remember the same event in fundamentally different ways. There is no single true history of Ulundi, only perspectives shaped by cultural inheritance and contemporary concerns. In the end, the Battle of Ulundi deserves to be remembered not as a celebration of imperial conquest, but as a case study in how military professionalism, applied to an unjust cause, can achieve precise and devastating results. Remember the date, July 4th, 1879. Coincidentally, the same day Americans celebrated independence from the British Empire that was busy conquering Zululand. Remember the tactical brilliance, a defensive formation so perfect that 40,000 warriors couldn't breach it despite extraordinary courage. Remember the human cost. Thousands of Zulu warriors killed defending their homeland, their courage wasted against overwhelming technological superiority. Remember that Lord Chelmsford, the general who presided over one of Britain's worst colonial disasters, redeemed himself through meticulous planning and absolute determination to never repeat his mistakes. His career demonstrates that failure, if learned from and corrected, need not be final. His tactical innovations, born from the humiliation of Isandlwana, revolutionized colonial warfare and saved countless British lives in subsequent campaigns. Remember that the Zulu warriors at Ulundi were not savages defeated by civilization. They were disciplined soldiers executing sophisticated tactics against an enemy with insurmountable technological advantages. Their courage in pressing attacks through concentrated rifle and artillery fire demonstrated military virtues any army would honor. That they were fighting for independence from colonial conquest only adds to their dignity. Remember that wars begun for cynical reasons, Frere's manufactured crisis to justify destroying an independent African state, can still produce genuine military achievement and genuine tragedy. Chelmsford's tactical brilliance at Ulundi doesn't justify the war, but neither does the war's injustice diminish his professional accomplishment. History is complex. People contain multitudes. Events can be simultaneously impressive and tragic. Remember that sometimes at critical moments, individual decisions matter enormously. Chelmsford's choice to march on Ulundi despite overwhelming obstacles, his development of the defensive square specifically to counter Zulu tactics, his absolute insistence on never dividing his forces again, these decisions shaped the battle's outcome. Different choices would have produced different results, possibly another British disaster or a prolonged, inconclusive campaign. History is not inevitable. It's shaped by human choices under pressure. Remember that technological superiority in warfare can create moral hazards. The British could defeat the Zulus not because they were better soldiers or more courageous, but because they had rifles and artillery. This technological gap enabled imperialism, allowed tiny colonial forces to conquer vast territories, and created a century of European domination over Africa and Asia. The pattern established at Ulundi, technological superiority enabling political conquest, would repeat across the globe, with consequences we still grapple with today. Remember that the tactics proven at Ulundi, Defensive concentration of firepower against infantry assault would be forgotten and relearned at terrible cost in World War I. The generals who sent millions of men charging into machine gun fire had somehow ignored or forgotten the lessons of colonial warfare. The slaughter at the Somme and Verdun was Ulundi repeated on industrial scale, but with Europeans dying instead of Africans. Perhaps, if military historians had paid more attention to minor colonial battles, those lives might have been saved. Remember that history's commemoration is selective and often unjust. Ulundi, a tactical masterpiece that ended a major war, has been largely forgotten, while smaller, less significant battles remain famous because they better fit narrative preferences. This tells us something important about how history works. What we remember isn't always what was most important, and what we forget isn't necessarily less significant. Finally, remember that wars have human costs that statistics can't capture. The 1,500 to 3,000 Zulu warriors who died at Ulundi weren't just casualties, they were people. Young men who had trained as warriors from childhood, who had families waiting for them, who had hoped to marry and have children and grow old. Their deaths, whatever we think of the tactical brilliance that caused them, represent real tragedy. The British soldiers who died, only 10, but 10 nonetheless, also had families, hopes, futures that were taken. War's human cost remains even when the cause is just or unjust, victory is glorious or shameful. The Battle of Ulundi ended the Anglo-Zulu War in a single afternoon of precision violence. It demonstrated what military professionalism, combined with technological superiority, could achieve. It gave one general redemption for previous disaster and consigned an independent African kingdom to history. It was forgotten by popular memory, but studied by military professionals. It was both a masterpiece of tactical execution and a tragedy of imperial conquest. On July 4, 1879, on grassland north of the White Mufolozi River, 12,000 British troops formed a perfect square and waited while 40,000 Zulu warriors attacked with extraordinary courage. For 50 minutes, modern industrial warfare collided with pre-industrial military culture. When the smoke cleared, one side had won decisively and permanently, and the other had lost everything. The details matter. The tactical choices, the individual courage, the military innovations, but so does the larger context. An unnecessary war, an independent nation conquered, a pattern of colonial expansion enabled by technological supremacy. This is our history, all of it, the brilliance and the tragedy, the courage and the injustice, the tactical achievement and the moral complexity. It's worth remembering, not to celebrate or condemn, but to understand. Because understanding how we got here, through battles like Ulundi, through decisions made by generals under pressure, through the consequences of technological inequality, helps us understand where we are and how to move forward. Lord Chelmsford died in 1905, still defending his reputation, still arguing that Isandlwana wasn't entirely his fault. He never got the unqualified redemption he sought, but he left behind Ulundi, a battle fought with such tactical perfection that it became a case study in military effectiveness, even as its larger context raised questions about whether such effectiveness should be celebrated. That ambiguity, that complexity, is perhaps the ultimate lesson. History isn't simple. People aren't heroes or villains, but complex individuals making decisions with imperfect information under tremendous pressure. Battles aren't glorious or shameful, but intricate human events with multiple meanings depending on perspective. And remembering, truly remembering with all the nuance and complexity, matters more than celebrating or condemning. The square at Ulundi held. That's the military fact. Why it held, what it cost, what it achieved, what it enabled, what it destroyed. Those are the questions history must grapple with. And we're still grappling, 145 years later, with the legacy of that perfect July afternoon when industrial firepower decisively defeated pre-industrial courage and changed southern Africa forever. This was the Battle of Ulundi, This is why it matters. This is what we should remember.